It was just 50 years ago, next June, that I first met Mel Wheatley. Mel came up to the Pacific Northwest Conference at the invitation of Bishop A. Raymond Grant to be the conference preacher. And the thing that struck me immediately were some of the sermon titles he had. It's an art to do a good sermon title. And you know, back in those days, a very popular author of the time was Joshua Samuel Liebman, who had written the book Peace of Mind. Some of you remember that book? You reveal your age if you do. Mel came, and the title of his first sermon was Peace of Mind is for the Birds. I had to go to that sermon. And my attendance was well justified because I heard a preacher. And one of the things that I think it's good for us to remember about Mel was what a tremendous artist he was in preaching the good news of Christ. Later, he preached a sermon, and Margie has in her notes someplace the outline of it, and she shared this with me. And this was the outline of his sermon. Face the worst, expect the best, do the most, forget the rest. How would you like to have heard that sermon? But Mel's reputation as a preacher is one of the things that will live on in the memories of all kinds of people. I didn't really see Mel again until both of us were delegates to the 1972 Western Jurisdictional Conference held in the University Temple United Methodist Church in Seattle. And at that conference, in the process of the voting, the way that it goes on, some of you know about, both Mel Wheatley and I, along with Bishop Wilbur Choi, were elected as bishops in the United Methodist Church. And this began a relationship, a friendship, a camaraderie that extended through all the years since that time. There came a time along about 1979 when a quadrennial event was coming soon, the Episcopal Address. And some of you are familiar with this, and you know that it's presented at the General Conference by a representative of the Council of Bishops. And the process is that someone is selected to write it. They bring a first draft, and it's always kind of funny to watch because they present the first draft to the council in a secret session. And then every time, it's happened every quadrennium since 1972, everybody stands with a standing ovation. And then that calms down, and the writer of the address says, are there questions? And someone will stand up, and almost invariably they will say, this was a splendid address, one of the finest that I have heard. But over on page 22, line 9, and then they get into it, and it goes from there. Well, anyway, Mel, along in 79-80, leading up to the 1980 General Conference in Indianapolis, took a stance that changed a procedure that had been going on in the Council of Bishops for 160 years. And this is how it happened. The custom had been and was at that time, after the Episcopal Address had been gone through several drafts and finalized, every bishop signed their name to the address. And if you look in old journals, you'll find that list. Mel had a problem of conscience with that address, because a portion of the address affirmed the action of the General Conference related to the exclusion of gay and lesbian people from the United Methodist Church and its ministry. I'm sure Mel must have gone through real struggles in terms of what he should do. But his final decision was a profoundly courageous one. He graciously and with due politeness and everything else declined to put his name on the Episcopal address. And the other day, I looked in the archives at the journal of the 1980 General Conference, and there was the Episcopal address, and I looked down the names. The name of Melvin E. Wheatley, Jr. is not on that list. He stood alone for the sake of his Christian conscience. And what happened, the next quadrennium, they quit that practice. And from then on, they have a majority vote, and the president and secretary of the council sign the Episcopal address on behalf of all the bishops. So Mel Wheatley, by this act of courage, a very lonely act of courage, changed this 150 or 60-year-old custom of the Council of Bishops. Mel Wheatley was not only a good and faithful servant of the huge Denver area during the 12 years he served there, he was a good and faithful general superintendent of the United Methodist Church as he labored with us in the Council of Bishops and the Western Jurisdiction College of Bishops, bringing to those arenas always good cheer, a rational but ironic spirit, sometimes a relentless probing, always with a sweet smile, but above all else, a profound concern that God's love and justice should permeate everything that we did together. And Bishop Melvin E. Wheatley, Jr. left a mark upon us and upon thousands like us, which we hope and pray and believe will one day be the mark of the United Methodist Church.